Okay. Okay, good. I think we're good.
Welcome everyone again. I have great pleasure to welcoming you together with my friend and co-host Rabbi Ben Skolnick. And we are going to have yet another lecture on Seljuk history, this time with a focus on military history. And I'm quite surprised how many even new listeners and attendees this has brought to us. So I am very pleased to see Dr. John Serrati with us, who is going to be our speaker today, and also Dr. Michael Taylor, who will be giving expert feedback. I'm going to introduce John very briefly, who will then give his paper, and later on, Ben will take over, introduce Michael, and will have his feedback before we then open the floor for a discussion. So I made friends with John previously at a Seleucid venue in Montreal for the Seleucid Royal Women Conference in 2013. And we reconnected last year in the context of this Seleucid lecture series, where he was so kind to take over expert feedback. And then, well, normally I invite people, would you like to give some feedback? It's not much work. And once they have taken the bait, then I say, and would you also want to give a lecture in the near future? I'm looking at Michael's face right now, whether he got this warning. So I was very pleased, and I've had many exchanges with John so far, and I think we are going to hear a very intriguing paper on a topic that is of high interest, namely the question whether the Seleucids had a similar system of settling soldiers as the Ptolemies. And John is particularly qualified to give this presentation because he has a steady flow of research papers over the last quarter century. Yes, John, it's a quarter century already, on all aspects of the ancient military, from the classical Greek period down to late antiquity. This fits into his broader interest into ancient imperialism, with a stronger focus on the Roman world. But we know, of course, that the Roman and Hellenistic worlds were closely interconnected. And I've also identified a focus on Sicily, on ancient Sicily. John has also co-edited 3 volumes, which are on any one of these topics, but also on the ancient economy, which is another of his interests. His most recent paper that I found on his website is on a very exotic topic, and I think many will be requesting an off-print. It's about female fighters in the ancient world, and not so sure whether it's more on the ancient world or on modern representations of the ancient world. So please send me an off-print right after this lecture. Now, we are all looking forward to have your presentation, John.
Altai, thank you so much. I can say, firstly, that it is on the it's on the ancient world, so I'll be very happy to send you an off-print later this afternoon. Right. So before going any further, I'd like to say that I'm lecturing from the traditional and unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. Acknowledging territory is a recognition of the presence of First Nations peoples in both the past and the present. I also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening our communities. Together as a diverse society, I commit to building sincere relationships with Indigenous peoples based on respect, dignity, trust, and cooperation in the process of advancing truth and reconciliation. So firstly, thank you to Ben and Altai so much for having me. Altai and Ben, you did not have to twist my arm at all. In fact, this has been a kind of dream of mine that you know, attending Seleucid events both online and in person. I always was so captivated and fascinated, and there is such a high level of scholarship that you know, it's great to be part of the Seleucid club now. So I feel that this is great, right? So thank you so much for the invitation. To my respondent, I just I thought I would let you know that Altai was generous enough to send me some very some excellent feedback on my paper, and I've slightly altered my conclusion to represent that feedback. So just to put all the cards on the table. So I have some slides. So can I get the power to share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. How can we do that?
I think you do not even have to be co-host. Do you
Okay.
see the icon at the
No, it
bottom?
says it has been disabled. Host has.
Okay,
so I just tried to share my screen.
So you can't?
No.
If you can make him co-host too, that should do the job, because I see the icon.
The slides are not great. I can do it without them.
No. Where do I, how do I do that? Oh, I see. I click on John, right?
Yeah, and then it should say make co-host there.
I'm sorry, I'm trying. I don't know how to do that. Wait a minute. No, wait a minute. Where's John? Here's John. I did it.
Okay. There we are. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, I'm going to myself. Okay. All right. So I will start the slideshow. Okay. There we are. Okay. Okay. All right. So once again, thanks for the invitation. So soldiers, settlers, and citizens Clearachoi in the Seleucid Empire. All right. So the 16,000 strong phalanx of the Macedonians, which formed part of the Seleucid army at the Battle of Magnesia in 189 BC, along with the 20,000 Macedonians who took part in the great military parade of Antiochus IV at Daphne in 166 BC, implies a permanent presence of troops armed as Macedonian phalangites within the Seleucid Empire. Many of these would have lived in military colonies called Katoikii, where they had been settled along with other members of the same military unit. The existence of Clearachoi, right, settlers who were given a plot of land, a kleros, in return for military service within the Seleucid Empire. We know these existed in Egypt. The evidence, I think, is fairly secure for that. Whether they existed and had the same function in the Seleucid reign is still a hotly debated topic into which I am throwing myself, right? On the one hand, significant evidence exists that a class of mostly Greek and Macedonian, but others as well, settlers known as Katoikoi, fulfilled the same functions as Clearachoi and garrisoned a number of Seleucid cities in exchange for farmland. On the other, many scholars have questioned the military nature of Katoikoi and whether a class similar to the Ptolemaic Clearachoi existed at all within the Seleucid kingdom. While past scholarship was indeed too quick to assume the existence of Seleucid Clearachoi style settlers based on simply Ptolemaic evidence, military settlers were commonplace during the 4th century in both Greece as well as in Macedonia. This, combined with their existence under the Ptolemies, makes it unlikely that some form of Clearachoi did not exist within other successor realms. Although this paper will argue for the existence of military settlers within the Seleucid Empire, it equally aims to illustrate that Katoikoi were fundamentally different from the Clericoi in Ptolemaic Egypt. The Clericoi in Egypt were often settled in sparsely populated areas and on fallow land. The Katoikoi of the Seleucid Empire, however, were almost exclusively allotted land in or near cities with existing and at times large populations. More importantly, the Ptolemaic system atrophied over time, whereas evidence indicates that the Seleucid system of military colonies remained robust and continued to provide experienced troops well into the 2nd century BC. As will be discussed, maintaining these colonies was militarily expedient for Seleucid monarchs. Equally, however, the system was beneficial to the individual Katoikos as well. Early on, good evidence exists which shows a number of Katoikoi making long-term investments in viticulture, so growing grapes for wine. While far more lucrative than growing grain, viticulture is very unstable and requires far longer to turn a profit. Therefore, already by the mid-3rd century, military Katoikoi were planning to keep possession of their land long after the point where they would have been involved in active military service. Well, the focus on large profits appears to have severed the link between military service and land cultivation in Ptolemaic Egypt. Within the Seleucid Empire, this provided the system with long-term stability and allowed soldiers to maintain themselves during their period of active service, and then to provide for themselves into retirement. The ability to engage in viticulture would therefore have been one of the main incentives for individuals to settle in and serve in the Seleucid military as Katoikoi. The practice of exchanging land for military service appears to be of significant antiquity. It is first mentioned by Herodotus in reference to the late 6th century, right? And a klerikos originally referred to something akin to a colonist who had been settled on land controlled by the Athenians around the Aegean. By the late 5th century, the term came to signify a man who had been granted a kleros, a piece of land in exchange for his military service. These klerikoi had been settled throughout the Athenian Empire and were meant to act as garrison forces. Unlike earlier klerikoi, who were permanent colonists, right? These allotments were temporary and held only for the period of a man's military service. In the 4th century, Athens continued to settle clerics in the English transliteration around the Aegean, mostly in places which were vital to the city's grain supply. Evidence indicates that these cleric communities had their own governments, their own religious rights, their own civic institutions, operating independently of the native population amongst whom they lived. Beyond Athens, the notion that land could be granted in exchange for military service was equally prevalent in Macedonia. Here, kings appear to have granted lands to Macedonian nobility in return for their loyalty as well as their service as cavalry in the royal army. Plutarch, and I may have lost the slide here. Yes, here we are, right? Plutarch implies that Alexander significantly expanded this process in order to secure the Macedonian homeland while he was on campaign in Asia. Alexander would not set foot upon his ship bound for Asia until he had finalized the revenue of his companions, allotting a farm to one, a village to another, and the revenue from some hamlet or harbor to still another, until at last nearly all royal property had been expended or allotted. So clearly, some of these, the fact that he's allotting farm, clearly some of these would be termed a kleros. Others, if you're granted the revenue from a hamlet, I would not call that a kleros. You would not be some sort of military colonist. But still, in Macedonia, the point is there is clearly a system which exchanges land for military service.
John, if I may just briefly interrupt and ask the question, Are you trying to move the slides? Because we are still at your very first slide, and some questions are coming whether
Aha.
have you been
Sorry.
moving them on your screen or
I have been.
okay, so that has
Perhaps
frozen.
they
My
are
guess
frozen.
is
I will stop the
stop
slideshow.
sharing and go back into the sharing mode.
Now you're doing.
Okay. And
Perhaps if there
I
is something
will-
on the previous slides you wanted
okay,
us to
I will, my apologies, and I will share the screen here. Okay, and okay,
so we see it moved. Should we just quickly try whether we also
okay.
see
Is it moving now, or is it still stuck?
stuck to slide 8?
Okay, I wonder. Okay, if okay, I think I may know what's going on.
Anyone from the audience may have some
Aha. Okay,
tech
I see.
savviness to give some
I'm
advice.
going to try this. Okay, I'm going to try this again. I'll share again. I think I may have figured out the problem. Okay, I want to screen share. Sorry about this, everyone. See, if
We've
we could all be in person together in lovely Waterloo, this wouldn't be happening. Okay, now, okay,
you made it bigger.
okay, is it moving now?
No, you're stuck on slide. Oh, now you're.
Yes,
now
moving.
you did it.
You have-
Okay,
But
it's
make
moving.
it
Okay,
make it smaller if you can.
make it smaller.
Here, it's too
No,
big.
no. That's actually perfect. It's
okay.
a perfect mode.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Okay,
Wonderful.
I can continue?
You
Yeah.
can continue, but if there has been something on the earlier slides that you found important, you might go back to it. We have enough time. But otherwise, just continue
no.
from the slide. That,
No, it was just a picture of the Athenian Empire. That's it.
Thank you.
So, and then I read out the passage from Plutarch.
Okay, great.
Okay. So right. So we have some, again, my apologies for that. I think what happened is that I had my computer in presenter mode. So that's what did it. So my point is that there exists a significant pedigree in Greece for the exchange of land in return for military service. And this pedigree also exists in a Macedonian context, right? And these two are interrelated. Many of the aforementioned Athenian clericoi had been settled in northern Greece near Macedonia. And so it would be reasonable to think that this system may have influenced Philip II, who initiated a policy of attracting good mercenary soldiers to the Macedonian army via the promise of agricultural plots. In establishing their own system of military colonists in parts of their realm, the Seleucids were thus continuing a well-established Greek and Macedonian practice by exchanging land for military service. What is known about the Katoikic system, actually I'll keep it there, what is known about the Katoikic system in the Seleucid realm pales in comparison, actually let's go here. Let's go there. It pales in comparison to the evidence we have for the soldier colonists of Ptolemaic Egypt. Right? It may therefore be useful to review this evidence, as it would be reasonable to conclude that the system under the Seleucids functioned in somewhat of a similar manner as did the previous system with Athens and Macedonia. Right. So under the, sorry, I'm jumping around there. You should be able to see Egypt there, Ptolemaic Egypt. So, right, under the Ptolemies, the purpose of the clericoi system was to provide the ruling dynasty with a stable pool of soldiers. By living in Egypt and having land to sustain themselves, the clericoi were meant to act as a group of armed men whose first loyalty would have been to the Ptolemies as a whole, or even to one specific member of the family. They were also to serve as a royal bodyguard, a garrison force in Alexandria, and a rural police force with the capacity to quell unrest or outright uprisings by the native Egyptian farming class. The Clericoi likewise ensured the cultivation of fallow lands in Egypt, thus increasing the royal tax base. Right, although it should be noted that that papyri would state fairly clearly that Clericoi, by and large, paid less tax than the native Egyptians. Finally, Clericoi were likely meant to act as a Hellenized and Hellenizing presence in the countryside, perhaps with a long-term goal of establishing a permanent non-native ruling class outside of the land's urban centers. The system worked well throughout much of the 3rd century and was significantly expanded by Ptolemy II. Clericoi not only formed a strong garrison force within Egypt, but equally did good service in foreign campaigns, in particular fighting with distinction at the Battle of Raphia in 217. Turning to the Seleucids, all right, although we know of some military katoikoi in Syria and Persia, right, which I'll come to the evidence for those, almost all of our evidence comes from Asia Minor. And this is a significant problem and a limit here that we have to perhaps work around, at least with some theory, right? Because here one runs into the same problems as we run into with classical Greece and we run into with Ptolemaic Egypt, right? That, you know, it is a staple of undergraduate courses to warn students that there are narratives beyond Athens, right? To say that oftentimes when we say the ancient Greeks did something, we really mean the ancient Athenians did something. Oftentimes when we make blanket statements about the Hellenistic world, what we really mean is the Ptolemaic Egyptians did something, or the Ptolemaic dynasty did something. That's all we can really say. That's where our evidence is, right? And even within Egypt, I made blanket statements about the Clericoi, but what I really meant was the Clericoi in the Fayum, because that's really where our evidence comes from, right? So scholars have always been tempted to make broad statements which liberally apply the significant amount of evidence from one area to a territory or time period as a whole. In the Hellenistic East, the location of epigraphic finds really challenges ideas about cultural homogeneity within the Seleucid Empire. The vast majority of inscriptions are found within areas with the highest concentration of Greeks, Asia Minor, and to a far lesser extent, Syria. Were there hardly any military Katoikic settlements outside these areas? Or did other places simply not possess the same type of epigraphic culture as the regions which bordered the Mediterranean? This is an open question, right? If epigraphic traditions in places outside of Syria and Asia Minor were not as sophisticated, then also we have to keep in mind that experienced stonemasons would have been in short supply, thus compounding the problem. Given the placement of military Katoikic communities near important borders with the Antigonids and the Ptolemies, we might reasonably speculate that the Seleucids, for whom, again, Clericoi types of military settlements would have been well known, we might speculate that the Seleucids may have settled soldiers elsewhere too, but there's simply not enough evidence to say. We have one piece of evidence to talk about soldiers in Persia, that's it. Right? So there's simply not enough evidence to say whether such a system was extended in any meaningful way beyond what we see in Asia Minor and Syria. As stated earlier, right, the entire existence of a system where land was exchanged for military service within the Seleucid realm is controversial. That Polybius uses Katoikia most often to denote a village has been cited as evidence for the claim by some scholars that in the Hellenistic period, these settlements ceased to have or had no military function, not ceased to have a military function. They had no military function to begin with. In this view, right, we should understand the term katoikoi as referring exclusively to villagers or locals. Right? However, the idea that the term katoikos or katoikoi in plural could mean inhabitant, could mean settler, has a significant pedigree in both the classical and the Hellenistic worlds, right? And Polybius uses it in this way as well, right? In some of these instances, the idea is that settlers have military obligations is clear. Specifically, the piece of evidence that everyone always starts with and often finishes with, right, is an inscription from Magnesia dated to 241, which Altai tells me he dates to 244. So I'm more than happy to say some point in the later 240s. Right. This speaks extensively about settlers, katoikoi, as forming cavalry and infantry for the Seleucids. Right. So this is the inscription there. Inscriptiones Smyrna, right, 573, OGIS 229, and then some very good commentary by Michelle Austin, number 174. Right. So it is clear that these men have an active service arrangement. They are an active service, right? Some of them are gone on active service. Some of them are at home in the colony, but they have military obligations, right? The inscription makes, which is extremely long, right? The inscription makes reference not to just land grants, but to muster rolls as well. So they're keeping track of the soldiers and their lands. All of this speaks to a sophisticated level of organization, as well as a long-term military commitment on the part of the settlers. Likewise, Josephus relates how in the early 3rd century, Antiochus III transferred 2,000 Jewish katoikoi and their families in order to quell a revolt in Asia Minor. These men were to guard the, quote, fortresses as well as most strategic places, unquote. Surely this speaks to the idea that they were experienced soldiers with ongoing military obligations, right? Furthermore, the person in charge of the transfer is ordered by Antiochus to give them each a place to build a house and a plot of land they can cultivate where they can plant vines. You shall grant them exemption from taxes on agricultural produce from 10 years until such time as they obtain produce from the until soil grain. No, sorry. Until such time as they obtain, that is a typo, my apologies, as they obtain produce from the grain, from the soil, comma, grain shall be measured out to them to feed their servants. Those who perform their duties shall be provided everything they need so that by receiving this favor from us, they may show themselves more devoted, right? Furthermore, right, so more evidence there, an inscription from Asia Minor mentions katoikoi as soldiers. Well, one from Susa, which is SEG 713, right, relates how the katoikoi belonging to soldiers of the garrison in Susa were, their lands, their kleroi, were threatened by drought, right? The famous Garub papyrus, which is there part of the Petrie collection, from 246 BC refers to Katoikic settlers near Antioch undertaking military duties. Diodorus refers to military obligations of Katoikoi who lived near Seleucia in Syria. That the latter served as cavalry would argue against the idea that they were somehow peasant recruits. Right? And although from outside the Seleucid realm, a number of scholars read the Kotoikoi mentioned in an inscription of Eumenes II from 181 BC as military men originally brought to the area by Antiochus II. That is SEG 19 there, the last reference, right? So these are originally military men who were planted there by the Seleucids, by Antiochus III, right? And then they passed to Eumenes II and the Attalids, right? To this may be may be added several pieces of literary evidence, which, although circumstantial, should make clear that the idea that certain Kotoikoi exchanged land for military service, that I believe that this cannot be just dismissed out of hand, right? Given the well-established Macedonian tradition of military colonization, the extensive use of Clericoi by the Ptolemies, and the focus of the early Seleucids on urbanization and the foundation of colonies throughout their realm, that at least some of the Kotoikoi were military settlements, or Kotoikia, I should say, were military settlements, seems a logical contention. The large number of Kotoikic settlements in the Caicos Valley in Asia Minor is one of the main reasons why the Attalid, probably one of the main reasons as to why the Attalids were able to break away from the Seleucids in 261 BC, right? As the former had a ready supply of experienced troops upon whom they could call. However, even if we wipe out all this evidence, even if we discount all the above arguments, which seems difficult, I have a great time discounting this evidence, right? The use of military colonists would surely have been vital in a polity the size of the Seleucid Empire. With so much military activity spread over so large an area, there's the Seleucid Empire, right? With so much military activity spread over so large an area, right? And with well-organized enemies in the Antigonids and the Ptolemies, the Seleucids faced a huge military expenses, right? In comparison with most Hellenistic powers, the Seleucids had, although their revenue was roughly equal, but the Seleucids had far more military expenses, right? They needed to maintain a significantly larger peacetime army in order to guard their extensive borders and garrison all their cities, right? The Seleucids had more expenses than the Ptolemies on the whole, right? And they also could not exact the same tax per capita as the Ptolemies could. As a result, the Seleucids needed to find creative solutions to narrow their financial disadvantage. Thus, having soldiers permanently settled near their most militarily active borders in Asia Minor and Syria would have been a simple case of military expedience. So, right, that these men lived in Kotoikoi, right, in Kotoikia, and did not need to be maintained in between campaigns, right, and did not need to be, the fact that they didn't need to be maintained between campaigns would have been an immense benefit for reducing military costs. So for me, this is just, it's the logical thing to do, you have an established system of military settlers, you have two very active borders, and so, you know, the two of them together equals military Kotoikoi. Given all of this, I would contend that it is significantly more difficult to accept that the Seleucids did not maintain military Kotoikoi than to believe that they did, right? Right, so I think it's, for me, it's just a logical conclusion that they would have had military Kotoikoi. So I believe, having established the idea that Kotoikoi in the Seleucid Empire could have been, that there is good evidence to say that they were military settlers similar to the Clericoi of Egypt, right? The characteristics of these settlements and the identities of the settlers themselves can now be examined, right? Firstly, The reason they are referred to as Kotoikoi as opposed to Clericoi appears to be because they were almost exclusively allotted land in or near cities with existing and at times large populations. This is as opposed to Egypt, where the Clericoi appear to have been settled almost exclusively in the countryside, away from most major urban centers. Being settled very close to cities, the Seleucid Kotoikoi, military Kotoikoi, served as both active soldiers as well as garrison forces. Right? As we see, evidence says that they may have, that all of them may have paid no tax for the first 10 years after their settlement. Afterwards, some may have benefited with tax-free status. However, even those who did pay tax were almost certainly taxed at a lower rate than native farmers. An added benefit of this system was, yes?
I think it was not for you.
Oh,
Was not-
okay. Sorry.
Just continue.
Right. I wonder if I have the power to mute all. Sorry. Yes, I do. There we are. Okay. Okay. Right. Right. An added benefit of the system was that it ensured the cultivation of the expansion of cultivation, thus increasing the royal tax base. All right. Each military Kotoikia was run by a strategos, and thus it is probable that, like the Ptolemies, the Seleucids settled entire units together. So we have good, again, epigraphic evidence for the strategos being in charge here. Right. This was a continuation of the policy of Alexander himself, who had settled many of his mercenaries throughout the Near East. However, in Ptolemaic Egypt, right, Clericoi and the native farmers appear to have lived in close proximity, whereas military Kotoikoi in the Seleucid Empire formed their own communities and were settled in areas separate from the local native populations. This sharp division between the privileged settler and the disempowered tax-paying local, with the latter likely working on the estates of the former, the farms of the former, would in all probability have been the source of significant tension within these regions, right? As was normal for military settlements, Kotoikoi would have been allotted a parcel of land which varied in size according to their rank. We don't have direct Seleucid evidence for this, but this is how Clericoi always work around the Mediterranean. From what we know, infantrymen received a plot large enough to support a family and turn a profit. Cavalrymen were better paid and required more land for the upkeep of a war horse, or in all likelihood, war horses. Right, and they tend to receive roughly about 4 times the land that infantrymen were given. For officers, on the other hand, the sky was the limit. Right, when looking at evidence from around the Mediterranean, officers appear to have had no maximum size for their plots, and over time they could end up controlling small estates, which would have been in excess of 100 times the basic infantryman's farm. For the Kotoikoi themselves, settlement within the Seleucid kingdom represented unique opportunities for social and economic mobility. The Hellenistic world in general was an employee's market when it came to warfare, and mercenaries were often able to name their price, as well as negotiate terms from potential employers. Even within this market, however, the Ptolemies were known to play particularly well, right? And this can be seen in how they were able to attract Clericoi from all over the Mediterranean, including lands controlled by the Seleucids. Military Kotoikoi within the Seleucid realm, on the other hand, from what we know, it's clear that they were not paid as well. They could not offer the sweet deals the Ptolemies could, and therefore they came from land which was came exclusively from lands which were controlled by the Seleucids. Unlike in Egypt, where military settlers were a heterogeneous group, right? In the Seleucid Empire, although we hear of Gauls, Jews, and Persians as Katoikoi, right, the majority appear to have identified themselves as Macedonians. The aforementioned 16,000 Macedonians in the Seleucid army at the Battle of Magnesia in 189, and the 20,000 Macedonians who took part in the great military parade of Antiochus IV at Daphne are a testament to this. That said, we want to be careful, since the designation Macedonian, it's clear that by this period in the Hellenistic world was not necessarily ethnic, but it could have referred to soldiers of any background who were armed as Macedonian phalangites and cavalrymen. Moreover, calling oneself Macedonian recalled the military prowess of Alexander and his army, as even well into the 2nd century, the Macedonian phalanx was still seen as the most prestigious place on the battle line amongst foot soldiers, while the Macedonian Hetairoi cavalry continued to be viewed as the preeminent mounted force, the most preeminent mounted force which had ever existed. And therefore, we can't simply assume that because soldiers are calling themselves Macedonian, that they were ethnic Macedonian. But all we can say is that we have references to Macedonians, Gauls, Jews, and Persians. That is all. All right. Evidence indicates that let's look at nice pictures now. Right. There we are. And they seem to be gone. I don't know if you can see my. No, my pictures are gone. Anyway, sorry. Okay. I had lovely pictures of nice Syrian rolling wheat fields. Oh, sorry. We here in Ottawa, we had a snowstorm yesterday, so I really wanted to look at some wheat fields. I don't know what's happened to them. Anyway, I'll continue, or maybe we can, if we could still see that there, I can just have it up like that, right? Oh, it's not coming out at all. Anyway, evidence indicates that the military Katoikoi early on grew grains on their plots. This is understandable, as cereals were the most common crop in the Mediterranean, as well as in Asia Minor and Syria as a whole. And thus the likelihood that some of the first Katoikoi had some experience in growing grains was probably high. Even those who did not were probably able to copy what they saw happening on nearby lands. Furthermore, the types of cereals grown in Asia Minor and Syria, emmer wheat in Asia Minor and einkorn wheat and barley grown in Syria, were extremely hardy crops, which would have been relatively easy even for inexperienced farmers to grow. Although it is low yielding and makes poor bread, emmer wheat is excellent for growing in hilly regions with moist soil, and hence it remained popular for a very, very long time, and you can still find emmer wheat grown in Turkey today. Einkorn is extremely hardy wheat and can survive in very poor dry soil, but is low yielding and also makes poor bread. Farmers in such areas, therefore, often made the switch from einkorn to barley, which, although barley had a much more bitter taste, it had a higher nutritional value and made a thicker, hardier bread. Right. The fact that emmer, einkorn, and barley are not particularly lucrative crops. Right, and the fact that einkorn and barley are also extremely difficult to hull. They're extremely difficult on the threshing floor, right? Explains the rapid switch of Katoikoi to viticulture, right? And down here I have some nice Syrian gray Syrian winemaking areas there. Right. Grapes offer significantly better yields, right, per hectare than grains, and they also require less irrigation. However, they are a very unstable crop and are more susceptible to changes in climate. In comparison to grains, grapes are far riskier and they require a long-term investment on the part of the grower in order to turn a profit. Moreover, they are more labor intensive than cereals, and so a Katoikos would have almost certainly required the funds to hire native seasonal workers for his vineyards. Right? Therefore, this switch to viticulture meant that a military Katoikos expected to keep and to supervise his lands in the long term. In Egypt, this switch proved so lucrative that the Clericoi ceased to perform their military duties and held their lands in perpetuity. The system of exchanging land for military service therefore fell into a decline amongst the Ptolemies, and the Clericoi played next to no role in Ptolemaic military affairs from the late late 3rd century onwards. In the Seleucid Empire, on the other hand, even with the switch to viticulture by the military Katoikoi, the system of exchanging land for military service remained vigorous. Hence, the aforementioned strong presence of the Macedonians, who again were probably soldiers merely armed in a Macedonian style, but again, the strong presence at Magnesia and Daphne. Although active in offensive campaigns, military settlers were primarily meant to act as garrison forces. And here is where we see the main difference between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid schemes. The system in Egypt fell into decline because outside powers rarely had the capacity to invade Ptolemaic territory. And so the system of Clericoi as a home defense force simply atrophied. The Seleucid Empire, on the other hand, faced extensive threats, both internal and external. Moreover, with so much territory to defend, the Seleucids faced huge military expenses. Having soldiers permanently within the empire who could be called into service on short notice, and who also possessed the capability of maintaining themselves while not on campaign, would have been of great benefit to any Seleucid monarch. Since the switch to viticulture required long-term investment, this implies permanent ownership as well as the right to bequeath one's kleros. Prima facie, this is what seems to have caused the decline of the system of the Clericoi in Egypt to atrophy. However, upon closer inspection, the switch to viticulture was not the direct cause of the Ptolemaic scheme's decline. In reality, what caused it was apathy on the part of the ruling dynasty. They simply decided not to maintain it and not to hold the Clericoi to their military service, right? In short, a combination of extreme wealth, they had enough money, safety, because they were have to really worry about outside powers invading, and Ptolemaic mismanagement, and these factors are all indelibly linked, right? By and large, caused the dynasty to simply ignore the ossification of the Clericoi scheme. In the Ptolemaic Empire, on the other hand, the upkeep of Katoikoi was vital, or military Katoikoi, was vital to the health of the realm and its hold on Asia Minor and Syria, two of the most urbanized and economically vibrant territories controlled by the Seleucids. Therefore, the Seleucids would have had a vested interest in keeping a close watch on the scheme and making sure that the military Katoikoi fulfilled their obligations to the realm's armed forces and also bequeathed their lands to those who could do similarly. Properly managed, there is every reason to view the system of exchanging lands for military service as a success under the Seleucids. And so the existence and maintenance of these military colonies should be seen as one of the prime reasons as to why the Seleucids were able to maintain such a powerful position in the Eastern Mediterranean throughout the 3rd and into the 2nd centuries BC. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you, John, for that very informative and stimulating lecture. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to call on Dr. Michael Taylor. Michael received his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley and is now teaches at the University of Albany. He's the author of a number of very interesting works, including his book, Soldiers and Silver, great title, Soldiers and Silver, Mobilizing Resources in the Age of Roman Conquest. As we keep growing our Seleucid study community, we're very pleased to include Michael in our ever-expanding group. And we're happy to ask Michael to offer expert feedback on John's stimulating lecture.
All right, well, thank you so much for this kind invitation. And thank you, John, for such an excellent and stimulating talk. Certainly, it's a privilege that rather than, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, good. Certainly, it's a privilege that rather than having to disguise my comments in the form of a question, I can now just give my comments in the form of a comment. So Professor Sarati has addressed one of the fundamental assumptions of Seleucid military history, that the Macedonian pikemen and cavalry that we see deployed in the literary sources of the great battles such as Raphia and Magnesia were settler soldiers who possessed plots, kleroi, that were explicitly granted linked to military service obligations. Now, the evidence that Professor Sarati has so cogently and thoroughly discussed is admittedly never as direct as we would like, and it must be deduced from bits and pieces. We have evidence of Katoikoi who hold kleroi, evidence that Katoikoi who certainly are soldiers or at least have military obligations, and at least one instance we have an explicitly Macedonian Katoikia, which then leads into Polybius's description of Macedonians, who presumably are likely pseudo-ethnic Macedonians rather than descendants from the Macedonian homeland, who fight in the Seleucid phalanx and heavy cavalry. And overall, I really concur with Professor Sarati's conclusion that the evidence is sufficient, that there's sufficient evidence in favor of military Katoikoi, that the burden of proof really must rest upon the doubters. That said, I just sort of hypothetically would suspect that if we could somehow go back in time and survey the soldiers in the Seleucid phalanx at Magnesia or parading through Daphne, I wouldn't be totally surprised that while many of them certainly occupied kleroi, and that a few of them, or at least some of them, didn't. Some of them maybe were sons of possessors of kleroi, epigoni, and others may have simply been citizens or even just inhabitants of Katoikic communities who volunteered to serve or even were conscripted at moments when the kingdom simply needed warm bodies in its military units. Now, certainly one of the interesting kind of comparisons with the Ptolemaic dynasty that Professor Sarati's talk has raised is the fact that we have the association of Seleucid Katoikoi with cities, whereas Ptolemaic Klerikoi seem to be predominantly rural. And I wonder if one explanation for the difference may be related to the problem of finding markets for agricultural goods. After all, in both kingdoms, kleros holders, klerikoi, were not supposed to be subsistence level dirt farmers, but were rather men who had been granted estates that could provide their possessors with a respectable lifestyle and the leisure to engage in military training and, in some instances, expeditionary service. And here, perhaps the sort of geography of Egypt versus the far-flung Seleucid realm may be relevant. Namely that in Egypt, rural Ptolemaic klerikoi could use the superhighway of the Nile to ship their crops to markets in Alexandria and then to the Mediterranean market that lay beyond. So it was possible to put someone in a relatively rural place, and they still had the capacity to get their crop to a more distant market in a way that was presumably profitable. Seleucid Katoikoi, however, who are obviously in a variety of geographic settings, in some instances the highlands of Asia Minor, needed local cities or at least settlements to provide them with an immediate market for their agricultural surplus. I also wonder if the dispersion of Khoikhoi across many different cities and settlements may have further contributed to the particular pathologies of the Seleucid kingdom. And certainly Professor Sarati notes the pathologies of the Ptolemaic kingdom, which by the 2nd century BC is in a bad place. But so I think we should also address the fact that the Seleucid kingdom also doesn't have a great 2nd century, at least over the long arc of the 2nd century. In the defense of Ptolemaic clericoi, they do seem to have identified quite strongly and directly with the dynasty, most notably when they flocked to Alexandria to support young Ptolemy V during the tumultuous regency. The loyalty of Seleucid settlers, Khoikhoi, however, seems to have been mediated in part by the urban community which they were associated with. Oftentimes a full-fledged polis with its own collective identity and also rooted in a regional network. And this therefore may have made Seleucid Khoikhoi vulnerable to supporting regionally based pretenders that so plagued the dynasty throughout its history. In the case of Kuros, which revolted from Antiochus the Great, the soldiers of the community could collectively rebel, seemingly in the absence of an immediate pretender, although perhaps coordinating with Achaeus. Now, Professor Sarati has cogently noted the military and economic advantages of the cleric system or the Khoikic system, but I think it's also worth noting some of the fundamental disadvantages. And firstly and foremost, there were simply not enough of them. Bar Kokhba provides us with a sort of back of the envelope estimate of 55,000 settlers available for service. And while I think we can quibble with his particular methodology, I think this is probably the right general or very rough magnitude. And personally, I would be very, very surprised if there were ever more than, say, 100,000 Khoikhoi. But this meant that heavy losses in battle threatened to wipe out this narrow military class in an instant. And certainly the Seleucids reeled from battles in which they not only lost, but took heavy casualties. The death of 10,000 men at Raphia, which was probably concentrated in the roughly handled phalanx, ended the Fourth Syrian War in an improbable Ptolemaic victory. And far heavier losses at Magnesia compelled the acceptance of the devastating Treaty of Apamea. Meanwhile, the destruction of the army of Antiochus Sidetes, which seems to have included a significant number of troops from Antioch, launched the dynasty into its protracted death spiral. That is, however intensively the Seleucids managed to conscript troops from this very narrow class of military settlers, we should probably note that among the major powers of the Mediterranean, they probably mobilized the lowest proportion of the kingdom's overall population. That is, that there are many non-Khoikhoi who simply go unused militarily by the dynasty. On a related issue, while Professor Sarati is certainly correct that fiscal motives explain the need to demobilize soldiers as tax-paying Khoikhoi, military readiness is inherently a problem for all reserve units. The particular beast that was the pike phalanx required a high degree of coordinated drill and expert weapons handling to function effectively. And at the very least, the military record of the Seleucid army, with its cadre of Khoikhoi, it's at best mixed. The system, which endured for several centuries, I think absolutely works to a degree, oftentimes worked well enough, but perhaps not entirely as well as it could have, or at least as well as Seleucid kings might have hoped. So again, those are just some thoughts responding to, again, this excellent and interesting paper, and thank you so much for inviting me to respond.
John, I wonder if you'd like to respond to that wonderful feedback.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Michael. Professor Taylor has definitely raised a lot of important issues, and for which I'm very grateful. I took a lot of notes here, and I think the paper is going to be much improved because of this. Yes, absolutely. I think I completely agree that yeah, I think, you know, to start off really with the last point, that you know, I think it always struck me that military settlers, specifically in the Seleucid realm, in Asia Minor and in Syria, their primary purpose is going to be for defense. And then calling them out to engage in something like raffia is going to be, that's not the standard. That's going to be atypical. Their primary purpose is defense. And so because of that, it's true, you wouldn't have needed as many of them. So I strongly agree with the idea, with Professor Taylor's idea, that that they would have formed a very small, perhaps not a very small, but a minor part, definitely not the majority of Seleucid forces. Right, and that yes, the idea that they could have, because they were not concentrated in one area. That's one advantage, and there's probably some disadvantages of it too. But the advantage of concentrating the majority of Clearicoi settlers in the Fayum, right? They're all together, easy to run, right? Easy to regulate, although they don't seem to regulate them very much. Right, but that having them in disparate areas means that yes, they can become involved in local disputes, and that's what I think happened with, you know, 261. We get the Athalids breaking away, and they have this ready supply of soldiers who are there, who can, you know, they're a defense force, and they, you know, they probably just, you know, up their pay or gave them better land or something. I mean, this is pure speculation, but it's clear that some of our evidence for military Katoika communities relates to the Attalids. So there's every reason, I believe, to think that these were once Seleucid communities who just simply sided with the Attalids. So that gave them a ready military force. And yes, this undoubtedly happened with pretenders at times as well. Right, and certainly something which I would like to explore further, though I agree it would take a lot of it would take theory, because, you know, the evidence is often just not there, is you know, what we can say with a relative degree of confidence about the civic institutions, about the civic structures of these military Katoika communities. And yes, I think Professor Taylor is absolutely right that undoubtedly there were Kleros holders within these communities who very well could have been conscripted or who could have volunteered for the Seleucid army, and who would have identified themselves as Macedonians and could have been called Katoikoi as well, right? And I love the thing about the Nile, that you're absolutely right, that they don't have the superhighway of the Nile, so settling them, that's another reason to settle them near cities, and I thank you very much for that. That is a really, really great point. Yeah. So Professor Taylor, thank you so much for those comments. I'm very grateful.
We'd like to know if there are other questions for John or for Michael.
I see we have a couple of hands. Do you want me to just go with the, should I be doing this?
No, we'll get it. Okay, so Altai, would you go first?
I think Christelle was first.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. That doesn't matter. Thank you very much for your talk. Nice to meet you. I've read a lot of your work and never seen you. Well, it's only virtual, but it's a good start. So thank you very much. I really appreciated that you were thinking thoroughly about this comparison, Ptolemies and Seleucid, and I've been thinking about that too. And I have, a couple of points. I guess to think through all together. One thing is the geography and the type of comparison we do Egypt versus the whole Seleucid Empire, right? Which is not always comparing apples with apples, and we should not forget. You mentioned, yes, they were, and we don't know much about Clerux outside, but I think that we shouldn't forget the empire, and that if you look at the whole Ptolemaic Empire, then there are maybe less differences or more similitudes between the two systems. Mm-hmm. So I have one example, but it's conjectural. It's Paphos, for instance, a new Paphos in Cyprus that specialists on Cyprus have now kind of argued that it was certainly a Katoikia initially. And so it looks like the Ptolemies are doing the same kind of things when they are outside Egypt. So the geography of Egypt is really special. And I think what Matthew Taylor said was really important also about the Nile as a canal to sell your supply. The other point about now back to Egypt, my second point is about well, we think, most were in the Fayum in this area, but we miss all the Delta area, right? And there may have been many there. So that's one problem. And second, the question of the level of urban, we often, think of Egypt as very rural, but I really think that in terms of pure population numbers, many of the villages of the Fayum are actually same size or even bigger than many cities. So, it's maybe not as rural as we imagine. Yet, yes, it's a different system, and you don't have, the question of citizenship. These soldiers are fine being privileged tax Hellenists, as we call them, if we accept that. So, I'm just wondering, whether we should be, careful also when we compare and think about micro-region and what is really very urbanized or not. And, with the Seleucids, it's also important. And finally, the last point, but, as a footnote, is just about decline in the 2nd century. I think, it's important to think about what Cleruchoi were still able to do. Indeed, not much it seems, but the Ptolemies were indeed able to hire many soldiers, Ptolemies VI especially, and we have to focus on his rule. And then he created politeumata, and we don't have that in the Seleucid case, and that's also something maybe interesting you want to include. So there were more kind of comments, but I really, it's a lot of food for thinking about that. Thank you.
John, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. First, just to not only thank Christelle, but to say it is wonderful to meet you as well. And it's really a treat for me because your work has so informed my own. So I'm very, very grateful for your comments. In fact, I can say I was reading your work just last night, updating the paper. So yes, I think the idea that Clericoi in Egypt are significantly more, or can be significantly more urban than they're often given credit for, is, I think, very, very correct. A very important point. I'm thinking of the instance with the whole affair with Agathocles, that guy Agathocles, where he tries to seize the throne, and there's all these machinations going back and forth. But to me, it's clear, looking at the evidence of that there is there are Clearcoy present in or very close to Alexandria. I think that has to be the case. So yes, I think I absolutely this idea that they are somehow only in the countryside is not correct. And I realize I probably portrayed it that way. I probably portrayed it too much as a little bit of a dichotomy in my paper, whereas it's closer to the Seleucid model. And yes, the Fayum is can be significantly urbanized, but yes, does lack the civic structures that you would have, and certainly would lack the I think the construction that you would get, the urban topography that you would get. Perhaps you would disagree with that, but that and you would this is an open question, but did settlements on the Fayum, or even large towns, were they walled? Did they have significant defense structures that we would see there? I don't think so, but I would bow to your superior knowledge there, Christelle.
No, I mean, we don't need anything in the Fayum, so we don't have protection there. But I mean, they are not directly at the frontier, so there may be more a pull to go outside than for defense.
Yeah, and certainly you see the similarity when we're talking about the Clearcoy who are near Alexandria. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So,
okay, Altai, did you want to speak?
Yes. So thanks a lot to our speaker and to our commentator. And I have to start with an embarrassing confession. I was confused while multitasking at the beginning and completely forgot to mention the affiliations of John, which was completely my oversight. And I find it's important to say also, for when anyone in the audience later might want to get in touch with John, who is a wonderful respondent. So be encouraged. So he is professor at the John Abbott College in Montreal, and also an associate or adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. So two addresses where you can find John on the website and figure out his email, unless you find it in the email that I am occasionally sending out with the list of emails. And that leads me to my next point. I think many of us will have some additional, traces of information or cases they know from the work that they do that might fit into the pattern that John has described to us. Some additional cases, some have come to my mind from Asia Minor and from Judea, and everyone in the audience will be welcome to put them forward here or to communicate them to John a little later. I do not want to speak too long, so that I will not give these examples, but I have a few more general questions. And one of it is, I wonder how reliable the distinction between the Ptolemaic rural and Seleucid urban method or pattern is, and some interesting hints have been given by Michael, referring to the Nile and the access to the cities, to the markets. But I wonder how much of this impression is also the result of our uneven evidence. So we have the distinct privilege from Ivich to even have many sources from the villages, even though these villages may not even be the kind of villages that we imagine, as Christelle has just explained to us. But I think I have a couple of indications for many more rural settlements, and probably of Kat Oikoi or Clearcoy throughout Asia Minor in less urbanized areas. So I just wonder whether this really did make such a difference in the time, or whether the kings, when they were looking for settlement ground, they needed good settlement ground that would satisfy their soldiers, and potentially they were also looking for a strategic advantage. But this might then have resulted in a rural or in a closer to urban settlement. So that is one point. And the other point is I've seen your paper develop a little bit, and the one interesting aspect that has developed is a clearer confession to perpetuity of possession of the land. Actually, well, if you want to satisfy soldiers, especially veteran soldiers, you cannot offer them temporary possession. They really then, towards the end of their life, when they want to found a family, they want something that they can also pass on. Anything else doesn't make sense. And your line of argument was focusing on the crops, or rather on the grapes that need long-term investment. So if I should not be wrong, assuming that settlement of veteran soldiers or still practicing soldiers, mostly locally, is long-term and perpetual, should we then not assume that basically every katoikia or military katoikia / klerokia would very soon develop into a permanent settlement that would be similar to either a village or a polis, and that the real problem of the kings was that if they wanted to continue the system, they would have to find ever new land. Because I don't think that any of the examples you have given provides us with evidence for a long-term use of this katoikia for settling ever new generations of veterans. So yeah, I want to end it here. If you've understood my two concerns, the first being the distinction between urban and rural as characteristic, or rather more contingent due to the evidence we have, and the second point relating to the perpetuity of katoikia, probably from the beginning on, and what does that mean for the system in order to be efficient, to be sustainable, and continued over time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Altai. To address those in order, the first is, yeah, I think in many ways it's a false dichotomy. Sorry, just hold on a sec. I'm gonna... My apology. Yeah. So yes, I think it's a. I mean, it's somewhat of a false dichotomy to see. It's not somewhat of a false dichotomy. It is a false dichotomy to see Egypt rural, Seleucid, Asia Minor, Syria urban. Yeah. That some of these would have been communities on their own. I maintain that if you're going to have them as a defense force, which I think was their primary purpose, they're not numerous enough to really, as Michael was saying, they're not numerous enough to really affect battle plans, to really so that they can be an offensive force on their own. They are going to form several units in a very large existing military force. So yes, I think I would maintain that settling them near cities where they can act as a garrison force. If they're going to be defensive, having them in towns which are not near urban centers, unless they are closer to some of them may have been closer to the Ptolemaic model, where they just want to, you're called up for a campaign. That's possible, but I think the majority of their purpose would have been for defense, and therefore you want to have them as close to your defensive fortresses as possible. And as for the second point, just refresh my memory. What was it?
The second point was about perpetuity of possession.
Perpetuity, yes, thank you. That's all I need.
Changes,
Thank you.
which may change the whole dynamics from the beginning on.
I think what we're doing here is that I think it's too easy. Again, I come back to my point about the evidence. It's too easy to take our one big example when we have very, very good evidence for this time period for a system of the exchange of land for military service atrophying, for gradually that we see the Clerici, they're not doing military service anymore. We have the infamous case of where a kleros is bequeathed to a woman, right? So I think that's the case that people keep coming back to. But in reality, if we look at the exchange of land for military service, it's actually the opposite, which is true, that a system is able to perpetuate itself even with long-term ownership. We look at medieval Europe, we look at the Mohawks, we look at the Zulus, we look at the Romans, this exchange of land for military service. Ptolemaic Egypt is actually the exception in that regard, where the system atrophies. We have a system, for example, in medieval Europe, where it was simply the case where whoever was lord there had to make sure that when you bequeathed your land to the next generation, it had to be to a son or to a close relative who would take up your military service. We see the same thing very close to where I am now with the Mohawks. We see the same thing with the Zulus. So I would maintain that it would be more logical to think that long-term ownership would not cause the system to atrophy, and that the Ptolemies would be the exception.
Okay, do we have other questions or thoughts?
I see Christelle has her hand up.
Okay, Christelle.
Can I just jump on that and the continuities and perpetuity questions? I mean, I'm with you in a sense that indeed that can, it doesn't have to atrophy over time, but even the argument of women getting the kleros, they are used as vehicle to pass to the next generation. So even in the Ptolemaic case, they are always mentioned it has to be within this group of population, notably soldiers. So actually, you can see it's a win-win for the king to be able to, keep the next generation. And if there is not a son just at that moment, the woman is actually used. So we have a couple of cases we can show that's probably the case. Now the question is to what extent, it was, we should talk about atrophy in the case of the Ptolemies, and it's also so connected to what sort of campaigns they've been doing and so on. But I mean, in general, I agree. It doesn't seem that they've been very active, and that they have to hire mercenaries more and more. But there are so many things we don't know. We don't know if the clerics were still kind of going for a couple of months in garrisons in the Delta. I mean, we have no idea. Yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted to defend the women, I guess. That's actually, it's not an argument for the decline, because they can pass on to the next generation and actually can, help the system to continue.
Yes, I certainly realize that. I mean, I raise that because a lot of that is often cited as evidence for a decline, and I do realize that certainly it can be read and has been read by you and others in a very different way, certainly, and that I think you're right. The military situation in Egypt is different. So is atrophy the right word? Is decline the right word? The military situation is different, and that leads to a different relationship between the Ptolemies and their soldier settlers. Yeah. So.
Yeah, Altai, is that your hand again, or is that a new hand?
Yes, well, if anyone else wants to speak, ask questions, I cede, but our time is too precious, and I'd like to tap the expertise. So I would have another question relating to ethnicity and ethnic constructs. I have seen there is a clear recent development that acknowledges that Macedonian becomes more a status moniker rather than something that looks at the real descent from the country of Macedon. And I, largely speaking, concur to this because there must have been so much of, well, I call it interbreeding or intercultural marriages in this whole system. I wonder, however, if we look at the example of the Jews from Babylon, which Antiochus settled in Lydia, the best documented case, at least in our literary evidence, which you quoted, how would they be referred to in a military context later on? I am aware that some Jews in Egypt could be referred to as Greeks. I've heard that a couple of times from my friend Stefan Pfeiffer. But I wonder whether for some time at least, the ethnic origin would have been preserved for a certain unit derived from those settlements, or should we rather think that they might have been called the Jews locally because it was a well-known settlement there, but when they or their descendants were recruited into the royal army, which would go on campaign, they would then have filled the Macedonian phalanx. Well, how should I bring this together?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Altai. That actually intersects with my other research. With the off-print I promised to send you. That really, the more I think about history in general, the more I think that so much comes down to conceptions, perceptions of gender. That masculinity, the idea of masculinity as an idea, is so important in history, and I think that's what we see in part with this designation Macedonian. Yes, they're armed like Macedonians, true, but the pinnacle of masculinity, the pinnacle of fighting prowess, martial prowess, the most feared people in war in the Hellenistic world, they all look back to Alexander and the Macedonians. And so you want to plug into that by calling it is a masculine distinction. It is saying, I am as masculine as the Macedonians. We see another example after this. Once the phalanx is at long last abandoned, we see troops from the east who've come to be identified as Romans. That we look at the rebellion of Mithridates, the rebellion, the war, the Mithridatic War. It's not a rebellion. And then the troops in so many of the troops in the civil wars are very happy to identify themselves as Roman. Why? They're not ethnically Roman, but it's because Romans possess the most masculine fighting prowess. And that's, you want to identify yourself with that as a fighter. The Jews, I would argue, possess a long tradition of masculine fighting prowess, of resistance to outside powers. They have their own martial traditions, so they don't have to plug into anyone else's.
Whoa.
So the Jews are very happy to self-identify as Jews because they do have a long tradition of resistance to outside powers. They have their own martial military traditions in that in the regions they inhabit, even within some diasporic communities. So that's why I would argue that Jews come to be identified as Jews in the sources, because for me, a lot of this is plugging into ideas of we want to identify as Macedonian because the Macedonians are everybody looks back to Alexander. We want to be associated with that, whereas Jews don't have to do that. They have their own martial traditions, which are very deep within their communities.
Thank you. I guess that Ben wants to respond to.
No, I love that. I would like to see an article just on that, John. I thought that was
Okay,
great.
sure. Actually, I think that in the future at some point I'd like to write something on that, because I think Herod really taps into that. I think he really taps into that, and I think he has Clericoid type communities as well, and that's where he gets a lot of his troops. So yeah.
Just to push back a little bit on that,
Yeah.
during the centuries, after the exile in Babylonia, there was the opposite tradition for Jewish people. Don't rebel, don't resist.
Yes.
And that's why the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, was a departure. That's why in the book of Daniel, you'll have all this nonviolent resistance. So that's what makes your remarks so interesting to me. It's almost like you have a two-pronged thing of, there is this tradition of King David and all of this stuff coming down. And on the other hand, there is, plant your gardens and build your homes and obey the foreign ruler. So you have both of those things.
You have both of those existing at the same time. Yes. Yeah.
I'm looking at these ideas and principles from a special Galatianist perspective. Those of you who know me a little longer will remember that my way towards Seleucid studies is actually through the Galatians, who had come into Asia Minor in 278 and the following years. And so I continue musing about Galatians being in the service of every Hellenistic ruler. Initially, yes, there was a big surplus of migrants, of warriors seeking service and seeking income. But at a certain point, these migration waves were not really continued. And I occasionally voiced the speculation that many of the later Galatians that we find in the later third or in the second century might, at least in part, have been recruited into, well, still ongoing Galatian groups or descendants of them. And now it's quite helpful to have the principle that you've mentioned, to have a martial image or a martial name for yourself. And the Galatians truly had that as well. So that they would not necessarily have been amalgamated with others then feeding into the Macedonian phalanx or so on. So that's a good idea.
And the same thing, if I may, the same thing we see happens with the Romans. When the Romans recruit even Spartans, we have some scant references to Spartans volunteering to or being recruited to serve in the Civil War. They come to be identified as Romans. There's no distinction, right? In the civil wars of the 1st century BC. But Gauls, even, that Caesar, when he recruits some Gauls and Germans, they're always kept separate. They're always identified as separate because they have established martial traditions. So you don't amalgamate them. In fact, sometimes their martial traditions are even more fearsome than the Romans. And so you want everybody to know they're from Galatia, just so you know that, so you want to have that out there. Yeah. So.
And Nicolaus, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just like to add a further nuance to this. So I was thinking about the terracotta statuettes, which have been found both in Syria and Mesopotamia. And there too, whilst we do find like little statuettes of Epheboy and Greek writers, the Persian writer model is still very popular during the whole Hellenistic period. So I would argue that also for the Persians, there is this distinct martial ethos, which is still quite present.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I would wholeheartedly agree that the farther back you go in Persian history, Achaemenid history, you see that, Cyrus, Cambyses, they come from a deep martial tradition, a very, very aggressive, hyper-masculine warlike culture. And we so easily forget about this because of the way they're often iconographically portrayed by the Greeks. Yeah.
I wonder if we could ask Michael to speak again.
Oh, I mean, I guess I was going to offer sort of the pessimistic take that probably many of these Jewish settlers from that wonderful passage of Josephus are just massacred by the Romans with everyone else at Magnesia. But my hunch is that's probably because, I mean, I guess I would be inclined to think they probably are simply getting rolled into probably mainline Macedonian units. And I mean, I would be inclined to think they are serving in the phalanx as Katoikoi. Again, that's a hunch and there's no evidence. There is that interesting passage in Livy for the battle, though, and he describes one of the Macedonian heavy cavalry units and describes them as, I think, Syrians, Phrygians, and Lydians. And I guess the question is, are these sort of Katoikoi, you know, if they are Katoikoi, are they starting to sort of be referred to by the region that they're settled in, almost therefore perhaps assuming the region, which then of course it's just like, I think Josephus, the Jewish settlers are in Phrygia. I mean, are they being settled in Phrygia when there's this military emergency, being recruited into the Macedonian army, and perhaps are they amongst the Phrygians in this sort of, you know, royal unit that Livy describes? But would suggest that there may even be several odd kind of ethnic kind of identifications of, you know, they may be Jewish, they may be starting to be identified by the region they're settled, and maybe have a kind of military identification as at least Macedonian style heavy cavalry. And of course, one wonders, you know, where might they themselves identify on that spectrum?
Yeah, I've thought of that as well. I thought, you know, okay, do the Jews get rolled into or not rolled into the Lydians? Are they the Lydians because that Livy just decides I'm going to identify them by where they're from? Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, Altai, would you?
Throw in something that's actually, of course, an obvious idea which I've never had. What Magnesia did to these early Jewish settlements, but that never came so much to my awareness. Whereas I always related the very strong and numerous Jewish communities in Western Asia Minor cities towards which we can trace starting in the late 2nd century BCE, and then of course we are reminded of them again in the early New Testament period through the travels of Paul. But we have very important documentary evidence encapsulated into Josephus's narrative, which attests to strong Jewish communities, such as in Pergamon. And I always related them back to these early military settlers. I may be misled. There might be other migration dynamics that just escape us. But if that should be if I should not be misled, then they may the Jews quite certainly fought loyally with Antiochus III, but they may have been on the lucky side of the army that just was not routed and could go home quite undamaged, and then lived on as all these other military settlers that, those who had their land plot, I don't think that any of those would have followed Antiochus's army beyond the Taurus mountain. So that is a more optimistic view, but I admit quite speculative, because we do not have the links in our evidence in the mid-course of the 2nd century BCE that would trace the later urbanized Jews to those Lydian Jews.
Altai, I wonder if you could wrap up and also introduce, you know, for May and June, and talk about our
Well, wrapping up, it was again a very ramified discussion that we've had, which is difficult to summarize. But I felt that there was a consensus with your main theory that we must assume a very intense system of Kadokia/Klerukia system in the Seleucid kingdom, ongoing well into the 2nd century, and that we should all put it onto our to-do list to look for more evidence so that we can complete our picture, both geographically, spatially, but also that these different kinds of evidence may allow us to better explain how the system actually worked, what the life of these settlers was, how specifically they contributed to Seleucid strength, but also to the development of Hellenization, urbanization in Asia Minor, and clearly beyond in the Levant and further into the Near and Middle East. So thank you so much, John, for having undertaken this work and having really inspired us with your argument. And we will all be looking forward to see how this research is ongoing. And I encourage everyone who is still listening to get in touch with John and help him complete the evidence. Thank you so much, Michael, for having supported our endeavor today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will try to put this lecture online onto our website, and our website already indicates the next lecture that we are going to have in a month's time, also Seleucid Wednesday. I have to pull it up to not say the wrong
By the way,
day.
John put his email in the chat box
Mhm.
for anybody who wanted to contact him.
Thank you. Well, May the 18th, our friend Aaron Almagor from Jerusalem will talk about Esther, the Queen, in the Septuagint Greek edition C and D. And this is also a Seleucid topic for those who may not know it. One of the marvelous novels of what in the Christian tradition is called the Old Testament, the later books. The Jewish name of these later books just don't come to my mind, but
The Ketuvim, the writings, the Ketuvim.
Yeah,
Right.
so many of them were actually produced in the Seleucid period and in direct response to the political, the political system, partly also the persecution under Antiochus IV and the ramifications. So this opened up a type of evidence which is not so much on the minds of of classical scholars who are largely confined to the Greek and Roman evidence. So a wonderful contribution to our common Seleucid endeavor next month by Aaron Almagor. Thank you all very much for joining. Ben, your last words.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
for having me.
Okay.